ጤና ይስጥልኝ የተከበራችሁ ተመልካቾቻችን፣ ይህ በዲያስፖራ ቴሌቪዥን የተዘጋጀ የሚቀርብላችሁ የጌራ-ሾው ፕሮግራም ነው። ዛሬ የጌራ-ሾው ፕሮግራም ላይ በድጋሚ ይዤላችሁ የቀረብኩት በአፍሪካና ቻይና ግንኙነት ላይ የተመሰረተ ውይይት ነው። ውይይቴንም የማደርገው ከስመጥሩ ኢኮኖሚስት ዶክተር ጆርጅ አየቲ ጋና ተወላጅ ከሆነ ኢኮኖሚስት ጋር ነው። አሁንም ተመልካቾቼ ፕሮግራማችን የሚሆነው የዛሬው በእንግሊዘኛ ነው። አብራችሁ እንድትቆዩ በአክብሮት ጋብዛለሁ። Good evening. Thanks for watching the Gera-show. As you know, China has been Africa's most important trading partner since 2009. China's looming presence on the African continent has created debate over whether African countries are benefiting or simply being used. Some argue that the Chinese do not care about Africans. All they want is more resources to compete with the US. Frank Pretoria from South Africa also argued that, quote, Africa only benefits if they can get technology and capital from the Chinese. Otherwise, Frank argues, quote, the relationship is not different than with other colonial countries. Others like Joseph Schiff from London, UK argue that, quote, Africa has a lot to learn from China right from the informal sector, vocational industry to electronics. He said, whether it's going to be a win situation really depends on whether the African leadership will adapt by creating conducive environment for both. Joseph also warns African and their leaders to be aware of the rule of game and see beyond their noses, else, he said, they will be taken for a good ride. David Karani from Tanzania also argued that both China and Africa will benefit. He said, quote, all that's needed to produce on both sides to ensure fair exchange. Despite China's growing presence in Africa, China's diplomatic and economic ties with Africa and China's enjoyment of economic benefit from Africa, African citizens who live in China are suffering from ill treatments. Africans who study and work in China are discriminated against in many ways. Currently, China is being accused of its inhuman and ill treatment of Africans during the COVID-19 outbreak, which includes forced evictions and quarantines. Of course, an accusation denied by China. Videos showing ill treatment of Africans by Chinese have gone viral on social media. Many are questioning if this is another form of racism. In my today's interview with Dr. George Ayittey, we are going to discuss the pros and cons of African and China relation in general and the treatment of Africans who study and work in China. Dr. George Ayittey is a Ghanaian economist, author, and widely recognized authority on political economy development in Africa. Dr. Ayittey is one of the leading advocates of African solutions for African problems. Dr. George argued that Africa's salvation lies in Africa itself, not inside the corridor of US Congress or the inner sanctum of the World Bank. He also argued that Africa's salvation lies in returning to and building upon its own indigenous institutions and traditions of free village markets and free trade rather than continuing to use the line and exploitative economic structures. Dr. George is one of the initiators and the president of Free African Foundation. Please stay with us. Dr. George, thanks for coming to the Gera-show. Well, tell us about the Free African Foundation a little bit, what it does and how it founded, since you are the president of that organization.
The Free African Foundation started, it's more than 20 years ago, way back in 1993. And what we wanted to do was to serve as a catalyst for reform in Africa. Mm-hmm. back then, at that time, almost all the reform efforts have been led by the World Bank, the IMF, and international donors. So we wanted to set up an organization which would sort of take ownership of the reform movement in Africa. And so we coined the expression African solutions for African problems. We wanted to lead the reform effort so that it's Africans who are taking charge of their own destiny and reforming Africa. Back then in the 1990s, almost everybody was, the World Bank and the IMF, they were pushing African governments to reform their economies. Nobody was pushing for democracy. We were among the first organizations, African-based organizations, to push for political reform. We said economic adjustment alone was not enough. We also needed political adjustment. I mean, at that time, back then in 1990, only 4 African countries were democratic. Only 4. And those countries were the Gambia, Senegal, Botswana, and Mauritius. So we started to push that, at that time when the Soviet Union collapsed, we said we needed democracy in Africa as well. So we have been in this struggle for a very long time. And we started with pushing for democracy in Ghana. And as a matter of fact, we were one of the very few African organizations that brought about democracy in Ghana. And we also started with and helped other African opposition groups in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, in many other African countries to bring democracy there. So that's what the Free Africa Foundation has been doing in promoting economic and political and intellectual reform in Africa. Those reforms led by Africans themselves, not dictated by the World Bank or the IMF.
Okay, now let me bring you about the current situation that we have with China and Africa relationship. In general, what do you think are the pros and cons of China's presence in Africa? Do you believe that African countries are benefiting or are simply being used?
Well, you see, strictly from the economic point of view, we should always welcome any engagement with foreign entities because we will always, benefit from engaging with foreign entities. But at the same time, we should be very mindful of our history. And that is the fact that every foreign entity that goes to Africa, that's so to pursue their interests. Americans go to Africa to pursue American interests. The French go to Africa to pursue French interests. The Arabs go to Africa to pursue Arab interests. And you can multiply this all along the line. The Chinese don't go to Africa because they love black people so much. This is where our leaders felt that this is where our leaders were at fault. They operated on the fallacious notion that the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. Now, since China was the enemy of the West, they thought the Chinese were Africa's friends. So in 2005, they went to Beijing and literally threw themselves at the feet of the Chinese. So they signed a blizzard of infrastructure for resources deals, so many of them. And, China sort of put up resources, loans to African governments. As a matter of fact, they unloaded so much loans that today, Africa's debt to China is about $143 billion. Now, after all this, we've got to ask yourself, how much benefit did the African people derive from all these deals with China? Now, mind you, many of these deals were signed up in secret, behind closed doors, without the authorization of or knowledge of the African people. And that's where a lot of exploitation went in. I can give you one particular example, which was so outrageous. Take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria's railway system had collapsed completely. So the Chinese came in and they said, okay, we will fix your railway system for you for $26 billion. Now, that was in 2009. Now, in exchange for that, we're not asking you to pay us back the 26 billion, but what we want is 1/6 of your total oil reserves. Now, can you believe that? 1/6 of Nigeria's total oil reserves. At that time, Nigeria had 36 billion barrels of oil. So 1/6 of that will come up with 6 billion barrels of oil. At that time, the price of oil was $100 per barrel. So 1/6 of that total oil reserves will be $600 billion. In exchange for what? For only $26 billion to fix Nigeria's railways. Now that was a huge exploitation by the Chinese. Now they signed up many other deals in Africa along similar lines. How did they manage to get away with this? You know, by paying bribes, by building presidential palaces for leaders in Sudan, Zimbabwe, Guinea. They built sports stadium for the people in Congo DR, Guinea, and several other African countries. That was how they managed to get these sweetheart deals from various African countries. So, as a matter of fact, you know, those deals didn't benefit the African people at all.
Interesting. And currently some also argue that China is creating a new slave empire by referring how Africans suffer under bosses in order to earn enough for a meager existence in diseased, malaria slums. Do you agree with that argument?
Well, you know, they have, Africans have been subjected to maltreatment recently in China, and they have also taken advantage of Africans, the African people, with many other spheres. But I have been concentrating on the economic relationship between China and Africa per se. And as I indicated, you know, they have signed this infrastructure for resources deals, which have really taken Africa to the cleaners, you know, plundered Africa's resources in Congo. They signed so many of these, bauxite, gold, diamonds. Take a look at Zimbabwe. I will give you another example in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, there are what you might call the Marange diamond fields. Back in 2009, it was estimated to have $20 billion worth of diamonds. Now, the Mugabe government brought in the Chinese to come and sort of exploit those diamonds. Up till now, Mugabe himself says that $15 billion in diamond revenue went missing from Marange diamond fields. Where did that money go to? Right now, Zimbabwe is totally broke. And when the coronavirus struck in Zimbabwe, the whole country had only 50 hospital beds in the entire country. This is something which makes me very angry as an African. We have seen, the plunder of Africa's resources with the connivance of the Chinese who somehow claim to be our friends. And they have exploited the people of Africa for far too long. And that we need to stand up and speak to the Chinese that we will not accept this anymore.
What do you think should be done by the AU and African governments to protect the interest of African nations and ensure fair deal in their diplomatic and economic ties with China?
Well, I think, the first rule or the first step that we must take is that we need to bring sunshine. Okay? Sunshine is always the great disinfectant. To shine a light on all these deals that have been signed in secret. We need to expose all these deals. The deals that the Mugabe government signed with China, we need to see what kind of deals they were. Some of these deals we need to repudiate. We have to repudiate them because the Zimbabwe people didn't sign those particular deals. And where those deals, we need to renegotiate those deals. That is what the African Union should be standing for, and stand with the people, not with corrupt and brutal and dictatorial governments and regimes in Africa.
Dr. George, let's talk about the African Forward movement that's being undertaken by the Partnership League for Africa's Development. What initiated this movement and what does it stand for?
Well, first of all, let me compliment you for broadcasting news about this particular movement, the Africa Forward movement. And it is a movement that was galvanized by the maltreatment of Africans in China because of coronavirus pandemic. Now, we all know that, the pandemic started off in Wuhan district province in China. But then all of a sudden, the Africans in China are being blamed for the virus. Some Nigerians have been evicted from their apartments in China. Even women with babies are being thrown out of their apartments. And they are being blamed for the eruption of the pandemic in Wuhan district in China. Whereas Africans had nothing to do with this virus. So we said, look, for a long time, the Chinese have been taking advantage of African hospitality and African docility, and that we're not going to take it anymore. If you look at our history for far too long, foreigners have been taking advantage of Africans and discriminating against Africans. We've had it from the Europeans. Now it is the Chinese. Not anymore. And that's why we have this Africa movement to stand up to the maltreatment that we have been being meted out to Africans by the Chinese.
How's China responding to the accusations of Africans being discriminated against by its citizens, and what's the African Forward movement doing to get a response and create awareness of this matter?
Well, they are denying it. They said that they are not engaged in discriminating against Africans, and Africans are our brothers and sisters. That's bull. Because we know what we are, Nigeria, Africans are being thrown out of their apartments in Wuhan in China. There's, if you go to YouTube, you will find evidence of this on that have been captured by movies. It's all up there on the internet. You find all this. So the Chinese cannot explain away or deny this. But even then, the Africa Forward movement is broader than just protesting against the Chinese. We're going to protest against Chinese embassies throughout Africa and make the Chinese aware that we're not going to sit there and roll over and play uncle, and that we're going to subject the entire Africa-China relationship under a microscope, and we're going to scrutinize that particular relationship. For example, we're going to look at the $143 billion debt that Africa owes to China. We're going to ask, how did we, contract this huge debt? What was the debt used for? What was the purpose of this debt? If you go to Kenya right now, there is the Kenyans built a railway from Mombasa to Nairobi at a huge cost of almost $1 billion. In fact, in Kenya, it is called the Lunatic Express to nowhere, because the Chinese double charged for that particular railway, and there's very little benefit that the Kenyan people derive from that particular railway. So we're going to look at how the money was spent. Right now, Zambia is completely broke. It cannot pay its debt to China. So China has seized control of Zambia's power utility company. The Kaunda International Airport is now in the hands of the Chinese. The Chinese police department, the Zambia Police Department, is in the hands of the Chinese. Now, what kind of neo-colonialism is this? So we are now, Africa Forward Movement is now calling for a scrutiny of all our relationship with the Chinese. We're going to make sure that the loans that we took from China benefited the African people. Loans that did not benefit the African people, or the loans that were not authorized by the African people, will be called odious debt, and that will be non-repayable.
So, Dr. George, so this movement, as you know, many Ethiopians and other African nations are suffering also in the Middle East, for example. And why are we taking on China at this time particularly? What do you say about that?
Well, it is not. It just happened that the maltreatment of China, the maltreatment of Africans at this particular time, sort of suddenly galvanized Africans to stand up and take action. But, we all know that this sort of thing has been going on for a long time, and that the Chinese have displayed racist intentions towards Africans for a long, long, long time. It's not just this happened all of a sudden. It just happened because of the maltreatment following the coronavirus pandemic, and that's why Africans are standing up. And we are demanding that we're going to look at our relationship with the Chinese and scrutinize the loans that we took from them, whether the loans benefited us. Obviously, they got a lot of benefit from the resources that they got from Africa, but what about us? They signed these agreements and deals with corrupt African governments and leaders without their people knowing.
Okay. For these African students and workers who are facing this kind of ill treatment in China, is there any resources available for them at this point? Do you know?
This is why we want to bring the African Union in, so that we can have the African Union on our side, and that the African Union, pushing the African Union to stand up for the people of Africa for once. For far too long, the African Union sort of colludes with African leaders and ignores the people. So we want the African Union this time to stand with us. And so hopefully, when they do, they will bring diplomatic pressure to bear on the Chinese and also to provide us with at least some kind of resources, even not necessarily, money per se, but at least some kind of recognition or media exposure. And for the African Union to say that, look, we don't like how our people are being treated in China. And that will help us a lot.
Do you think this ill treatment soured the existing diplomatic relations between China and African countries?
Could you run that by me again?
Okay. Do you believe this ill treatment soured the existing diplomatic relations between China and the other African countries?
One particular Ghanaian Africans which have been suffering. It is, we have Nigerians have been complaining, South Africans have been complaining, Kenyans have been complaining, Ghanaians, Guineans, so many of them. So it's not just one particular country and the diplomatic relations with China. There have been a whole lot. Right now we are mobilizing Africans. We have mobilized Africans in 25 African countries. So that's quite a lot.
How is this movement being received by African governments? I know you're mobilizing people, but how do you see it at this moment?
Obviously, African governments would not want us to rock the boat because they feel that, it's an embarrassment to them and that the Chinese are our friends. But then again, it depends. What kind of friendship do we have from the Chinese? When the Chinese throw us out of their apartments, evict us and blame us for a coronavirus that we have nothing to do with. So now is the time for reckoning, and that we are calling for our own government. We're putting pressure on our own government to decide whether they are with the Chinese or with their own people.
When Dr. George, when the lockdown is over, what do we expect from this movement? I know because of the limited time that we have, we're about to wrap up our program. What do we expect next when the lockdown is over?
When the lockdown is over, we're picking a second Saturday. When the lockdown is over, we're going to start protesting against each and every Chinese embassy in Africa. So far, we're planning demonstrations in at least 25 African countries. We hope to mobilize more students and more young people to protest before Chinese embassies in more African countries. That's number one. Number two, we're going to be writing about this protest and this more treatment in the various newspapers, public media, also on social media. And we're going to also call upon governments to repudiate various loans that they have taken from China. We feel that, some of these loans should not be paid back. So those are some of the actions that will be taken when this lockdown is over.
Great. Dr. George, thank you again for being on the Gera-show. It's an honor to have you. And in near future, we will have definitely another discussion regarding to this movement. And on behalf of the Gera-show and the Diaspora Television team, we wish you a very good luck on this movement. And I will say good night for now.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor.
Bye-bye.